Hello, everybody. It's very nice to be with you today, albeit via the disembodied medium of Zoom. Far nicer if we could meet in person. But for now, hopefully I can at least share a few remarks today that will be of interest as the SWEEP meeting gets underway. One of the things that's striking about the climate change issue is how we've come very far in what is relatively a short time. Only a few years ago, many people regarded climate change as a distant theoretical future threat, whereas today we can see that actually it's upon us and represents a real and present danger. And at the same time as awareness as to the imminency of the climate change issue has risen up the agenda, we've also now had this realization that the nature crisis is equally urgent, and in some ways even more urgent, as we see reports now across the world of declining wildlife populations, 2/3 reductions in vertebrate populations over the period since 1970, 1 million species at some risk of extinction globally, ecosystem decline across many parts of the world, including through the effects of deforestation. These issues now are right upon us. And whereas once we might have regarded these two things as separate challenges, the warming of the atmosphere on the one hand, and the decline of wildlife and the degradation of ecosystems on the other, we now see these two things as being fundamentally related. They're fundamentally related in that these two problems are feeding off of each other. As we destroy tropical rainforests and see the decline of the boreal forests as a result of excessive heating, dry weather and forest fire, as we look at the degradation of peatlands and the emissions of carbon into the atmosphere, we can see that the decline of nature is adding to the warming of the atmosphere. And as we see the further warming of the atmosphere, so we find those new conditions feeding back into the decline of nature, not only in the form of forest fires, but the bleaching of coral reefs in the tropical ocean and the disruption of seasonal patterns leading to changes in wildlife populations. So those two things, the warming of the air and the decline of nature, are contributing to each other in really quite troubling ways. At the same time, we can see that not only are these challenges related in the nature of the problem, but also in the nature of the solution, with many people now looking to nature-based solutions as part of the way in which we might not only navigate the decline of nature and to halt and to reverse that, but also to help us be more resilient to climate change and indeed to mitigate some of the emissions through the restoration of the natural environment. And so as we look to the future, we can see that there is some strong overlap between how we approach the nature and climate crisis. And also we can see an emerging realization that if we take the right steps to have those integrated approaches to combating the problem and to finding those solutions, that we might actually be able to do something for the economy and society in a broader sense at the same time. And alongside this rising awareness and acceptance of the need to take urgent action, we've also had this rise of this idea of natural capital, and a natural capital approach to the future being front and center of how we plan for a resilient and sustainable future. And actually, this marks really quite a major departure in how we've talked about these subjects over many decades. For quite a long time, it was my direct experience that politicians, people in finance ministries, the leaders of major corporations, they saw the decline of the environment and climate change as regrettable, but inevitable as part of the process of achieving progress. And indeed, the economy would be grown at the expense of nature, with this being a trade-off that was perfectly acceptable. But today, we find ourselves in the place where we know that we can't continue like that, and that these problems now are beginning to feed back into the human world, with the costs of climate change impacts and the threats to food and water security linked with that and the decline of nature actually taking on quite astronomical proportions of their own. And so this idea that we can actually repair nature and fix the climate at the same time as laying the foundations for a strong economy and sound and sustainable society into the future is really quite an important joining up of different agendas that wasn't there until even quite recently. And so as we look to the future in terms of how we might begin to stitch together a plan that unites action on the climate problem with the nature decline problem, at the same time as leading to economically rational outcomes, we can see a series of policy tools in this country beginning to come into shape in ways that might help us go to the future with more sustainable outcomes as a result. And the ways in which we might do this are becoming apparent through a series of what I find as really quite encouraging examples across the country. So for example, in the case of our water supply and water security into the future, some organizations, water companies, are beginning to find that investing in nature is a good way of helping them to meet their business objectives at the same time as helping to mitigate some of the effects of climate change. So for example, the restoration of blanket bogs in different parts of the uplands of Britain is helping there to be cleaner raw water coming from the hillsides in ways which is helping to cut costs of those companies because they don't need to have the machinery and the energy needed to strip out particles from the water. And at the same time, those uplands, in having healthier blanket bogs on them, are able to mitigate some of the risks of flooding that we're seeing occurring as a result of more intense rainfall, and of course helping to reduce carbon emissions, and as those peatlands recover, beginning to trap more carbon in the land, thereby helping us to meet our long-term goal of net zero. And similarly, as we look to the future of agriculture, I've been speaking to many farmers across the country who are actively trying to restore the quality of their soils. For many decades, the soil quality has been declining as a result of the style of agriculture that we've employed. And whilst that made sense decades ago, looking to the challenges of the future, we can see that locking up more carbon in the ground in organic matter not only helps to improve the fertility of the soils, but also again helps to catch carbon from the atmosphere and helps to reduce flood risk at the same time as helping to improve water quality. And as we look to these fundamentals of nature, we can see a series of policy tools that we can increasingly employ to help us go on this journey of more resilient landscapes that are bringing a range of different benefits. One of those new policy tools is the idea of an environmental land management scheme that will take us from land-based subsidies and into the payment for land managers for delivery of public goods, carbon capture, cleaner water, public access and well-being, and of course the recovery of biodiversity through doing agriculture and land management in more sustainable and joined up ways. We also have new tools coming through the Environment Bill, which will enable developers to invest in net gain for nature as a result of there being a stronger connection between new housing and other development and the recovery of the natural environment. And we also have coming through new strategies for the delivery of many tens of thousands of hectares of new woodland across the country, and also a new peatland strategy, both of which are backed by a new Climate for Nature fund. We also have the context of us now committing on the global stage to achieving 30% of our land and sea to be in protected management by 2030, again adding impetus to what is already a strong ambition in the government's 25-year environment plan to leave nature in better shape than we found it. And from my perspective as the chair of Natural England, one of the things that I'm most excited about is how we're now working on a strategic nature recovery network for the country, again to implement one of the core commitments in the 25-year environment plan, but to be a framework whereby we can pull together all of these different new tools of the agricultural policy of net gain, the existing protected area network, and to deliver those in an integrated manner whereby we get the maximum benefit in this country for the delivery of those different benefits: carbon, water, flood risk reduction, public health and well-being, benefits for tourism, and of course the recovery of our wildlife to boot. So this is quite an exciting time, as I see it, in terms of these different threads of thinking finally coming together with some policy tools that actually could add up to really quite a vivid new picture we can paint with that jigsaw of new opportunities. So it's about integrating, it's about coming with a holistic view for how we can meet those challenges of the environment at the same time as future challenges of the economy and social well-being. One of the best ideas that I've come across during recent years, actually I got from the Cornwall Environment Partnership some years ago, when they explained to me how they were feeding into policy at the level of the county the idea of environmental growth. So flipping over really the idea of economic growth and applying that to the natural environment, and pointing out to policymakers in Cornwall how key sectors of that county's economy, fishing, agriculture, tourism, in the end were based upon a healthy natural environment. And so logically, what the county's economic strategy would be one founded on the growth of those environmental assets: a healthier ocean, a more beautiful and vibrant countryside with productive soils, and those assets in the end then underpinning those key industries which are so important in that part of the world. So I do think we've arrived at an interesting moment, and having worked in this field for about 35 years, I can safely say it's not been like this before, where we have had this broad understanding of the fundamental connections between nature and the economy and society, and increasingly a set of tools that can help us realize some of the opportunities that the science now tells us are at hand. So I do hope that your conference this week will help some of these ideas have even more life and vibrancy, and that over the coming years that the southwest of England will continue to be a real leader and a beacon of good practice and inspiration, and not only for this country, but actually on the global stage as well. Thank you very much indeed.